Any visitor to Paris today will likely pass through the Bir Hakim metro station, the closest station to the Eiffel Tower. It was named in commemoration of the victory of the Free French forces in Libya over the joint Italian-German forces of General Erwin Rommel. With few victories to celebrate, this celebration of a World War II victory is practically unique in France. World War II is not a topic that most French people want to discuss. It is much easier to talk about the Great War and French heroism at Verdun. World War II is too complicated and ambiguous to be a source of national pride. Nevertheless, it is an unavoidable part of French history, with a legacy that both contemporaries and modern scholars have been forced to confront. This legacy has given rise to myths and many debates. Some have tried to portray the occupation as the trigger of a heroic patriotic fervor, while others have seen cowardice and guilt. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. The defeat that France suffered in May and June of 1940, though catastrophic and shocking to contemporaries, is much less interesting than its consequences. In 4 years of foreign occupation, France endured hardship and fear on a national scale, a fate that shaped its present and changed its future. Germany's invasion of Western Europe on May 10, 1940, was preceded by warning signs. During the 1930s, Hitler's Germany had been rearming and openly defying the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. However, France was unprepared to face this threat. Despite increasing warnings, in less than 2 months, Germany conquered France. World War II had begun 8 months earlier when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. Britain and France stood in defense, but waited for Germany's next move, resulting in a period known as the Phony War. In May 1940, the Germans bypassed the Maginot Line and invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the Ardennes Forest instead of confronting the French border. Within 10 days, they reached the Atlantic coast, splitting Allied forces. The British Expeditionary Force and part of the French army were evacuated at Dunkirk. On June 11th, Paris surrendered, and 3 days later, the German army entered the capital. France was shocked to see its powerful army collapse in just 6 weeks, becoming the subject of memes today about its quick surrender. Thousands of civilians fled the invaded regions, overwhelming the southern provinces with refugees and causing resource shortages. This temporary exodus revealed the fragility of trade routes and the government's inability to calm the nation in times of chaos. The occupation after France's surrender on June 22nd divided the country into 2 parts: the zone occupied by the Germans in the north and a puppet regime led by French Marshal Philippe in the south. The Germans had neither the time nor the energy to govern all of France, so the puppet regime was established. The Italians, who had helped in Hitler's conquest, also received a small occupied zone as a reward. On June 14, 1940, when the German army entered Paris, 16 Parisians committed suicide. It is difficult to determine how many of these suicides were a result of the invasion. However, suicide historically had a Republican flavor in France, in direct opposition to Nazi totalitarianism. Thus began the German occupation of northern French cities. The urban areas of the occupied zone, such as Paris, Tours, Bordeaux, and Dijon, were heavily affected by the German presence. These cities underwent a newly controlled economy and a rationing system, resulting in significant changes in the local economy. The German administrative and military presence forced constant contact between the two populations, raising the difficult question of how to deal with the occupation, to collaborate, to resist, or simply to survive under the circumstances. In Paris alone, approximately 40,000 Germans were present from 1940 onward. They occupied administrative and military positions and drastically transformed the city's demographics and environment. Although Paris had the largest concentration of Germans in France, other cities experienced similar occupations. The changes brought by the occupation were complex and had significant consequences. The Germans' first step was to transform French industrial and agricultural production into a controlled economy with a rationing system. This generated inflation, and gave rise to black markets that supplied goods unavailable on the official market, often at exorbitant prices. Additionally, wage controls worsened the economic crisis, resulting in shortages and high demand. The German presence in urban areas raised the question of how to act under occupation: resist, collaborate, or find a middle ground. There were different degrees of economic collaboration and forms of resistance. However, most French citizens did not clearly fit into these categories, merely seeking to survive and endure the occupation peacefully. The most impactful element was the prohibition against showing hostility toward the occupiers, giving them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. Thousands of German soldiers quickly flooded Paris, occupying famous hotels as headquarters for Reich military and political organizations. Additionally, the exchange rate between the franc and the German mark was fixed at 20-1, allowing German soldiers to stockpile cheese and wine. Officers were no different, requisitioning supplies from the French people. Trains left France daily loaded with luxury items, exotic foods, and valuable works of art. During the German occupation in France, anarchy and lack of social structure facilitated a rise in crime. The boundaries between the police and criminals increasingly blurred due to the black market. Frequently, authorities turned a blind eye to black market activities and even participated in them. Jurisdiction also became problematic during the occupation. French police forces often interfered to prove their competence and gain autonomy. However, they were in fact merely doing the SS's dirty work and then lost control of the situation. It was the French police, not the German, that were responsible for rounding up Parisian Jews in July 1942 and placing them in a cycling stadium on the outskirts of Paris, where they awaited their fate in collective misery comparable to the post-Hurricane Katrina period. Nazi officers imposed a nationwide curfew, banning any activity between midnight and 6 a.m. The curfew, which was used as a form of control and subjugation of the population, was moved earlier several times in response to acts of civil disobedience. Fake police officers took advantage of the atmosphere of chaos and impunity. They posed as law enforcement agents to extort bribes, steal, and threaten the population. This practice relied on anonymity and flourished especially in large cities such as Paris. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 800 robberies committed by fake police officers were recorded in the capital. Urban life during the occupation was dominated by a list of forbidden behaviors. It was forbidden to show hostility toward the Germans, to offer help to former French soldiers, or to anyone trying to cross into the free zone. Exposure to foreign propaganda was strictly prohibited, whether through radio, ownership of radio transmitters was criminalized, or through communication with countries hostile to the Reich. The possession of concealed weapons was prohibited, as well as less obvious acts of subversion, such as taking photos outdoors, gathering without express permission, or displaying flags. One of the most striking features of urban occupation was the physical presence of the Germans. They occupied large civilian buildings, such as schools and seminaries, to create administrative centers. Many organizations ceased to operate, and the daily lives of the French were especially affected by the lodging of German soldiers in their homes. This represented a constant invasion of French citizens' lives and a daily reminder of their precarious circumstances. OK urban centers were the initial cradle of the resistance, although as the war progressed, it became an increasingly rural movement. However, before 1942, resistance within France was mainly northern and urban, concentrated in cities such as Paris or Tours. The urban resistance pre-1942 had not yet achieved a high degree of organization and was instead mostly limited to isolated incidents. The cutting of cables was a particularly common act of sabotage. These cables facilitated the smooth operation of the German military machine. Graffiti was also widespread. The phrase "À bas le gouvernement de Vichy" appeared as early as 1940 in Dijon, scribbled on a wall near a public square. As the war progressed, the V for victory began to appear in Dijon and other cities. Clearly, none of these acts of vandalism posed a real threat to German soldiers. The communication cables were quickly replaced, and the graffiti phrases posed no real danger. but their importance lay in their symbolism. The Germans responded to these actions with collective fines and, occasionally, violent reprisals, but somehow their symbolic potency diminished. Fritz Sauckel was appointed by Hitler as the general plenipotentiary for labor deployment during World War II. His responsibility was to secure foreign labor for the Reich at any cost. Sauckel launched a program called Relève, or relief rotation, in cooperation with the Vichy government. The idea was to send French workers to Germany in exchange for the release of French prisoners. This strategy aimed to promote the program and turn working in Germany into an act of patriotism. Although the Relève brought about 250,000 volunteers by the end of 1942, it still fell short of the expected quota. In February 1943, Sauckel pressured the Vichy government to endorse compulsory labor service, known as the SUTO, Service du Travail Obligatoire, or compulsory labor service. This required all healthy men between 18 and 50 years old, and all single women between 21 and 35 years old to perform any work that the government deemed necessary, no matter how arduous. No matter how the Vichy government tried to disguise this new scheme, there was no way to hide its true nature as a slave labor program. The introduction of the STO was the breaking point for the French people, leading to the rise of the resistance and the formation of the maquis, which were resistance groups in rural areas. The German policy of collective punishment led to the execution of entire families if a resistance member was identified. As the occupation advanced, this policy became an indiscriminate retaliation, resulting in mass graves and deserted villages where inhabitants were massacred by the SS or Gestapo. In addition, French collaborators known as miliciens were even more insidious. They formed a paramilitary force that worked together with the occupiers and the Vichy government to keep the French under control. Some police officers were far-right fascists who had existed even before the war, while others were drawn in by the perks offered, such as better rations and exemption from mandatory service. Torture was frequently used by interrogators to extract information from suspected resistance members, leading directly to the massacres committed during the occupation. However, the collaborators realized that their cooperation would not go unpunished. In June 1944, the Normandy landings broke the German hold over France, with the resistance playing a significant role by isolating German forces in the region. Operation Dragoon, launched a month later in the south of the country, forced the German withdrawal from the occupied territories. In Paris, the resistance managed to seize an arsenal of German weapons, including tanks, as chaos spread. News of the fighting reached the Allies, resulting in angry crowds in the streets. A Free French armored division arrived in the capital, leading to the prompt surrender of the Nazi governor. During the occupation, French industry became heavily intertwined with and dependent on German industry. In 1941, around 7,000 French companies were fulfilling German orders, both civilian and military, a number that doubled by 1944. This German demand revitalized French industry, which received 70% to 90% of its orders from Germany. Renault, for example, one of France's leading car manufacturers, entered into partnership with the Germans shortly after the armistice, seeking permission to produce for the German Air Force. Although France was officially neutral, producing war machines to be used against its former allies was concerning. Therefore, it was established that French companies could produce tanks, submarines, and airplanes, but without weaponry. However, this did not prevent weapons from being later added to production, and France played a crucial role in supplying arms to the German war machine. At its peak, French factories were producing up to 800 aircraft per month. Economic collaboration was closely linked to the urban experience of the occupation. Most French industries were concentrated in the north, which became the occupied zone. The major northern cities, where Renault was located, were affected. The Germans exercised significant control over French industry, forcing the closure of around 1,500 factories by June 1942, mainly in the Paris region. These factories, such as those producing paper, ceramics, textiles, and furniture, were seen as distracting from the war effort and wasting essential resources. Beyond economic collaboration, there were also personal relationships between German soldiers and French women. Although it is not possible to determine the extent of these relationships, they were more common in urban areas where the German presence was greater. Paris, for instance, housed around 40,000 Germans in 1940. These relationships were widely regarded as a form of collaboration, and the women involved faced harsh reprisals after the liberation. Estimates of the number of French people executed for collaboration during the war vary, but approximately 10,000 individuals were likely victims of this punishment. Later, trials known as the legal purge occurred. Interestingly, those who managed to avoid justice on their own ended up being interned in concentration camps initially built by the Vichy government. Additionally, France suffered great damage to its infrastructure due to Allied bombings prior to the liberation, resulting in around 150,000 civilian deaths during the occupation. Of these statistics, an impressive 30,000 people were executed directly by the Germans for various crimes against the regime, while another 60,000 fought and died alongside the resistance. During the occupation of France in World War II, the country's economy was significantly affected, mainly due to the introduction of a rationing system imposed by the Nazis. This system controlled the distribution of consumer goods, including food, clothing, and tobacco. Ration cards determined the amount of food each person could receive weekly, resulting in a significant reduction in the population's caloric intake. However, due to the scarcity caused by the rationing system, a black market developed in response to the widespread need for goods. This illegal market involved exchanges and transactions outside the official distribution system, with prices much higher than those set by the government. People turned to different strategies to obtain products on the black market, including receiving food packages from relatives in the countryside, exchanging ration cards, and purchasing smuggled goods. Moreover, the black market was not limited to food. There was also a demand for counterfeit ration cards, which functioned as a form of currency and were frequently stolen or traded on the black market. Other products, such as leather, coal, and tobacco, were also scarce and subject to requisition by the Germans, leading to creative substitutes such as shoes made with alternative materials and the use of herbs and dried grass to produce a tobacco-like mixture. Despite control attempts through the rationing system, shortages persisted, especially in basic food items such as meat, bread, and potatoes. The population resorted to extreme measures such as hunting wild animals and adopting a diet with improvised substitutes. The black market and the rationing system, along with the creativity and resilience of the French people, became fundamental elements of life during the occupation. During the war, transportation was affected, with gasoline shortages and restrictions on the number of cars on the roads. The French began using bicycles as an alternative. The scarcity had physical and psychological repercussions, with children shorter due to malnutrition and an increase in disease. The daily struggle for survival paralyzed the development of effective resistance. The occupation caused humiliation, with a focus on individual needs rather than the well-being of France. The search for food dominated diaries and highlighted class differences. A black market emerged where exchanges were based on reciprocity. In Dijon, the occupation began with a supply crisis, as peasants refused to send products to markets under prices imposed by the Germans. Rumors and gossip circulated, such as the supposed illegality of sending potatoes to Paris. The food shortage worsened over time, leading to the closure of stores and pastry shops. Lines and waiting became part of the daily life of city dwellers during the occupation. Ration cards were required, but those with priority cards could avoid the long lines, leaving few resources for others. The queues also served as social and political forums, where information and rumors were shared. Price controls and rationing were ineffective, while wages remained stagnant. Prices continued to rise while wages fell, making food unaffordable for 2/3 of the population. The devaluation of the currency under German control further worsened the economic situation. A French historian writes that between 1940 and 1944, the average French citizen spent most of their time trying to find something to put in the dinner pot. Perhaps this does not present the most honorable or exciting image of the cities in France during the war, but it gives us a realistic one. The image of most French people was that of a débrouillard, a survivor who was neither heroic nor entirely abject, but someone who adapted to difficult circumstances. Urban life in occupied France was full of uncertainties. How to deal with the Germans one was forced to encounter throughout the day. What to do in case the electricity supply went out, as it almost always did. How to take an ideological stance, supporting either the collaborators or the resistance. How to stretch one's salary in a declining and controlled economy. And, more importantly, how to navigate this economy in order to subsist and live through the war. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.